Thank you everyone for joining us here today at the Levittown Public Library. Today is Wednesday, July 21st, approximately 6:30 p.m. And we are here to hear Bill Blyer and the true story of the Culper spy ring. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, thanks everybody for tuning in. Probably if you have any interest in American history, hopefully you'll know this is George Washington. But you probably may not know who this is. This is Robert Townsend of Oyster Bay, who becomes the chief spy in New York City for the Culper spy ring middle of the Revolutionary War. But a lot of people at the time did not know he was a spy. George Washington definitely did not know he was a spy. But it's people like Robert Townsend and the other members of what later becomes known as the Culper spy ring that helped Washington win the war, and is the reason why we're the United States of America rather than part of the British Commonwealth. So there's a lot of interest in the spy ring, particularly since 2014 when AMC put on their series Turn, which generated huge interest in the whole operation. Unfortunately, the history is kind of mangled by the series, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So Washington is a self-taught general and a self-taught spy. Early on, he learns almost at the cost of his life the value of military intelligence and the hazards you encounter when you don't have it. And this happens during the French and Indian War when he's a colonial militia officer assigned to a British column going out to attack the French and Indians at what is now Pittsburgh, at Fort Pitt. And the British not only use bad tactics, they march out in their redcoats and like they're in the middle of Europe when the French and Indians are fighting Indian style from behind trees and rocks. But the Americans have no idea who they're facing, and the British, they don't know, how many they're facing, where they are, what their plans are, anything about what's happening. And not surprisingly, they blunder into an ambush in which General Braddock is killed. A large part of his force is killed or captured. Washington miraculously escapes with bullet holes in his uniform, but isn't wounded. He rallies the survivors and gets them back to Eastern Virginia. But he's now keenly aware of that if you don't know what your enemy is up to, you're in big trouble. He carries this lesson into the American Revolution when he's named commander-in-chief of the Continental Army when it's still up in Boston. So after Washington and his army drive the British out of Boston, it's pretty obvious that their next target will be New York City. So Washington moves his army there to prepare for the expected attack. And right away, he's again in an intelligence vacuum that hurts him. He doesn't know when the British are going to come. So he finds out when they sail into New York Harbor. He doesn't know what their plans are. He finds out when they land in Staten Island. He tries to send spies to Staten Island, but they can't. He can't find the right people to get the right information, and is basically blind. So when the British cross the harbor and land in Brooklyn, he's surprised again. And then he has the problem of what are their intentions. He's not sure if the attack in Brooklyn is the real attack or a feint. So he stays in Manhattan with half of his troops until it's clear that the British have basically put all their forces into an attack on Brooklyn. So he crosses the river with the rest of their forces and still doesn't know what the plan is. He has defensive lines along Brooklyn Heights and down towards where the Gowanus Canal is today on the Heights, but they don't know where the British will attack. And there's 5 passes that lead through those lines up through those hills. Washington and his generals say, we'll defend the western 4 passes, but they decide the easternmost in Jamaica is too far east, and the British would never go that far. And all they do to defend it is put 4 American cavalrymen on horseback in the pass as basically eyes and ears. The British plan is to do a surprise feint attack on the western end of the line, in western Brooklyn on the right side of the American line, and then march all night with the bulk of the army up through Jamaica Pass to get behind the Continental Army. They do that very successfully. They capture the 4 guards on their horses, capture them, get the bulk of the army behind the American lines, and start to roll up the whole American flank. And the war probably could have ended that day if General Howe had been more aggressive. But late in the day, he decides to halt the attack and regroup, figuring that the Americans up on their entrenched line on the heights are too strong to attack. And he said he'll basically do a siege, which could take weeks. This gives Washington a chance to regroup, and then famously the next night get all of his troops that have not been killed or captured the first day back across the East River to Manhattan. So again, Washington has learned a hard lesson about the need for intelligence. So the first thing he does when he's back in New York is to say, okay, I need to know what the British are doing, because he knows the British has a very refined espionage and intelligence gathering operation. So people have been trying to figure out ever since exactly how it worked, who was involved, and the major inroads into this historical research were done by this gentleman, Morton Pennypacker. He writes two seminal books, one in 1930 and one in 1939. In the first one, he basically lays out entirely how the spy operation worked and who was involved in it, which is a huge breakthrough. And then the second book in 1939, he answers, in the first book, he says that the chief spy in the city is Robert Townsend of Oyster Bay, who I showed you in the sketch. And then he proves it, that Townsend was the spy in the city named Culper Jr., by having a handwriting analyst compare the writing in Culper Jr.'s letters to the account books that Robert Townsend kept for his merchant father Samuel out for his business in Oyster Bay. So he proves definitively that Robert Townsend is Culper Jr., who is sort of the missing link, or the last one to be fully identified. So in any case, Washington retreats across the East River, and then when he's there, he immediately sets to work to create the intelligence network. So he tasks Colonel Thomas Knowlton with setting up a unit made up of young officers who can conduct intelligence gathering, either through reconnaissance and ideally through spying. And Knowlton has a meeting of all the young officers and said, I need somebody to go across to Long Island and spy on what's happening in Brooklyn and the rest of Long Island. All of the officers, none of them step forward, not because they're cowards or afraid of being killed, but in this era, being a spy is sort of the lowest form of humanity, and none of these men, who are generally gentlemen or college graduates, want to debase their reputation by being spies. So Knowlton has no volunteers on the first day. One of the officers is not at the meeting, and that's a lieutenant named Nathan Hale. He misses the meeting because he's sick. The next day, he learns all about what Knowlton had said from his fellow officers, goes to the colonel and volunteers, and he says, I've been in the Army for a year. I haven't done anything really to earn my keep or help the cause, or even earn my pay, and I will do it. And when he tells his fellow officers, they say, don't do it. It's a suicide mission, because Hale did not have the kind of personality to carry off a secret identity. He's a very kind of guileless, open personality. And the people that know him say, you're going to give yourself away, and you're not going to come back alive, which was a pretty prescient opinion. This is a statue of Hale in City Hall Park, where he ends up on the gallows eventually. And it's true, he's a bad choice to be a spy. He's a Yale graduate, and he decides he's going to go and portray himself as a poor Dutch schoolmaster. So he leaves everything behind that might indicate he's reasonably well off as a schoolmaster. So he leaves his silver belt buckles and anything else that might indicate he's not a poor Dutch school teacher behind in Manhattan, with the exception of his college diploma, which he keeps on him. So it has his Yale diploma with his real name on it when he goes across the Sound, which is a major mistake. But he travels with a sergeant who's a friend of his out to Norwalk, Connecticut from Manhattan, thinking that he could get a ride across the Sound there, and it would be far enough east that he would not be intercepted by British warships. So he gets out to Norwalk. He runs into somebody who was in his first regiment named Charles Pond, who's now the captain of a schooner that's a privateer, which is in a private vessel commissioned by the government to attack enemy vessels. So Pond arranges to take him across from Fairfield to, I'm sorry, from Norwalk to Huntington in company with another privateer vessel. So he has bad luck, and we know the end of the story, but his major piece of bad luck is who who's out to find him. And he lands in Huntington, and the folder is placed on the site in what's now known as Hale site in his honor. When that area was developed in the 1950s, the developer put this monument on the what was thought to be the actual landing site. Later, the town of Huntington moved it further south towards the town, but it's now by a traffic circle. But he comes across, and the person who ends up chasing him and then eventually catching him is this gentleman, Robert Rogers, who's probably the biggest hero on the American side in the French and Indian War. He's a native of New Hampshire, grows up in the wilderness, and knows a lot of Indians, learns Indian tactics. During the French and Indian War, he forms his own unit called Rogers Rangers, which becomes famous during the war and afterwards. There was a novel about him and a movie with Spencer Tracy. So when the revolution breaks out, because he's an American, he goes to George Washington, and who knows who he is from his reputation. Rogers offers to serve the Continental Army, but they can't agree on what his rank and role will be. Rogers leaves in a huff and goes to see General Howe, the British commander, and volunteers to work for the British. Howe realizes what an asset he would be, makes him a colonel, and tells him to form a group called the Queen's American Rangers, and says his mission is to patrol Long Island Sound and Long Island for traders, spies, and try to recruit people for the loyalist regiments manning Long Island. To help Rogers do his job, Howe gives him a British warship called HMS Halifax at his disposal. So sometimes he's on the Halifax, sometimes he's wandering around Long Island, or he has his own vessel that he sails around on. But the Halifax is out on the Sound, and the captain's contacts tell him that two suspicious American vessels had crossed the Sound the night before. So the captain of the Halifax tracks down Rogers, takes him aboard, and they presume correctly that the American vessels have dropped off at least one or more spies. Rogers surmises correctly that the spy would probably be heading to Brooklyn, which is where the concentration of British troops are on Long Island. And the British occupy all of Long Island after the Battle of Long Island. So Hale is moving west as suspected, and Rogers sails to Sands Point, gets put ashore, quickly picks up Hale's trail because Hale is doing stupid things like asking people what they think about the British occupation and saying, what British units are around and what are they doing. Most of the people left on Long Island are Tory loyalists, because most of the Continental Army patriots have fled to Connecticut. So he's talking to people that are pro-British and suspicious, and it doesn't take long for Rogers to pick up the trail. And Rogers tracks him to an inn or tavern somewhere, we believe, in the area of Great Neck. Nobody knows for sure. He goes in, spots Hale sitting there, invites himself to sit down at the dinner table. And while they're eating, Rogers says to Hale, you wouldn't know this, but I'm actually a Continental Army soldier here spying and trying to gain recruits for George Washington. The not overly suspicious Hale confirms his own mission. Rogers then says, well, we should continue this conversation at my tavern, my inn, the next morning over breakfast. And Hale agrees. So the next morning, when Hale sits down with Rogers, some of Rogers' Rangers are at the table already. And as soon as Hale reveals his mission, Rogers arrests him, and they drag him out. And loyalists out in the community have already spotted Hale and start, cursing at him and making fun of him. So Rogers takes Hale to General Howe's headquarters in Manhattan. All the soldiers testify what they heard Hale say. Hale has diagrams and incriminating documents on him. Howe quickly signs a death warrant. The next morning, he's hanged. We don't know exactly where. There are multiple versions of where the execution takes place. But we also don't know what he said before they pulled the ladder out from under him to let him hang from a tree somewhere in the area of City Hall. we're pretty sure he did not say, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," because that quote first shows up being attributed to Hale in the early 1800s, long time after he died. And it also happens to be an exact quote from a play called Cato by Joseph Addison, which is popular at the time. And it's unlikely that Hale probably knew the quote because he was educated, but I doubt he would use that quote as his final words in life. There were British officers in attendance. They all talk about Hale dying bravely, and sort of generally what he talked about, but nobody actually wrote down his last words. So the famous quote we learned in fourth grade is probably apocryphal. So Hale dies. It's an embarrassment and painful to George Washington, who never talks about the episode again, but he still needs spies and he still needs intelligence. So Knowlton is killed and most of his men killed with him at battles in Upper Manhattan before the British push Washington out of off the island entirely. So Washington needs to come up with another plan. And for some reason, and we don't know why, he hires a businessman from upstate Fishkill who has business in the city named Nathaniel Sackett to be his next spy master. We don't know what Sackett's credentials were, but we do know it didn't work out well, and Washington fires him after about 2 months. So the choices Washington has made so far, and he's learning how to be a general and run a spy network on the fly here. So Sackett turns out to be a terrible choice, doesn't produce any useful information. But the one smart thing Washington does, and he's always a good judge of young upcoming talent, which is why he surrounds himself with people like Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And one of those people that he elevates to his staff is this gentleman, Benjamin Tallmadge, a Yale classmate of Nathan Hale, who's from Setauket out in the North Shore of Suffolk County. Tallmadge knows nothing about spycraft either, but he enlisted early in the army in Connecticut. He flees to Connecticut early in the war, becomes an officer in a Connecticut cavalry regiment, fights valiantly around Philadelphia, and Washington sees that and brings him onto his staff. So he tells Tallmadge that since Sackett is a civilian, Tallmadge will be the liaison between Washington and Sackett. And Sackett is bad, and Tallmadge is very bright and energetic and industrious and starts to really pull things together. So the first spy they come up with who successfully operates on Long Island is a Major John Clark, who's a Philadelphia lawyer. And Tallmadge arranged to get him over to Long Island sometime in early 1777. And Clark is everything that Nathan Hale wasn't. He's very discreet, careful, smart, doesn't incriminate himself in any way. So he spies very effectively on Long Island for 9 months and sends messages back to Tallmadge across Long Island Sound and on to Washington. Sackett isn't doing much of use, so Washington fires him, pays off his bills, and still needs another spy master. In the meantime, he's in the dark and then suffering again from lack of intelligence because the British keep outflanking him and outguessing him. But then Washington gets a real break. It comes from a gentleman, another friend of Tallmadge from Setauket named Hale Brewster, who's a whaleboat captain out on Long Island Sound. And you see him here on the right in this 1950s era mural in the Setauket School. And he's meeting with Abraham Woodhull, another Setauket friend from childhood who becomes the chief spy for the whole spy ring. And in this illustration, Woodhull is giving a book with secret code letter in it to Brewster to carry across the Sound to Tallmadge. So Brewster writes, Brewster is really the spark for what becomes known as the Culper spy ring. He writes an unsolicited letter to George Washington on August 7, 1778, which is, I guess, what most historians would say is sort of the official or unofficial beginning of the Culper spy ring. But he offers to gather intelligence on Long Island Sound and on Long Island, where he goes frequently, even though he's well known as a patriot, and get it to Washington. And Washington is thrilled and said, get me everything you can, spare no expense, no effort to get me as much intelligence as you can. Brewster gets that letter a week later, immediately writes his first report on August 27, 1778, saying that Sir Henry Clinton, who has succeeded Lord Howe as the British commander in New York, is planning to attack the Patriot stronghold in Newport, Rhode Island. That allows Washington to alert the garrison and reinforce it to the point where Clinton doesn't even bother making the attack. So he's pleased that he's got somebody supplying very good detailed information, but he still wants a whole network. After firing Sackett, he says to General Charles Scott, the commander of the Virginia Infantry Brigade, that he's now the intelligence chief. Another bad choice, because Scott shows very little interest or almost no interest in intelligence gathering. Plus, he's commanding this infantry unit that's in heavy fighting continually up north of the city. The smart thing Washington does is he keeps Tallmadge in place as the go-between and second in command. So Tallmadge basically ends up doing all the work and doing all the thinking. They also disagree on tactics. Scott likes the sort of take somebody, send them behind enemy lines, get whatever you can, and come back out. Sort of the method used by Nathan Hale without great success. Sackett had done the same thing, and all of the people he sent either came back with no useful information, or they didn't come back at all. Either they were captured or they just ran away, which is why Washington fired him. But Scott still likes that approach, and there's sort of this argument going on in headquarters, and it's annoying Washington. Finally, I guess he expresses his displeasure to Scott, who resigns as not only spar chief, but as a general in the Army and goes back to his farm in Virginia. So at this point, he elevates Tallmadge, who's only 24, and becomes a major as his director of military intelligence. So one of the first things Tallmadge does is recruit another childhood friend from Setauket, Abraham Woodhull, who's a local farmer, to be involved in intelligence gathering, and Woodhull agrees, although he's very nervous about it, to be the chief, basically be the chief spy on Long Island. And this is his farmhouse that survived until about the 1950s and then burned down in a suspicious fire. We don't know exactly when he recruits Woodhull and when the spy ring sort of becomes its regular operation, but we know sometime in the fall of 1778, Woodhull begins traveling into the city, gathering information and ostensibly gathering supplies for his farm, comes back out and initially verbally and then in writing starts to give letters to Caleb Brewster to carry across the Sound to Tallmadge, who would be waiting in Fairfield, Connecticut, and then would ride them to Washington's headquarters north or west of the city. And that becomes the basic operation. Caleb Brewster is sort of operating independently when he's not ferrying messages back and forth and also supplying information. So Woodhull is a very nervous individual, and you can tell that when you read the letters that survive. And they weren't supposed to survive because almost in every letter, Woodhull is beseeching Tallmadge and Washington to destroy his letters as soon as they read them, because he's afraid they'll fall into British hands and he'll be captured. And in the beginning, Tallmadge and Washington do that, but then they get lazy or whatever and start to either save the originals or save copies. When they get into coded letters, they would save the decoded copies. And if Woodhull had ever known that, he probably would have fled to Connecticut and ended the spy ring right there, but he never figured it out. But it's a continual concern. And Washington and Tallmadge are also concerned about security because they know the British are much better at this game than they are. So they start out very early in the operation giving code names to the main players. And Tallmadge develops a list of names early on with Woodhull. So Woodhull becomes Samuel Culper. Tallmadge becomes John Bolton, and all the other players get their names. Not all of Washington doesn't, and Caleb Brewster doesn't. Meanwhile, there's Tallmadge in his Connecticut cavalryman's uniform. So initially, Woodhull is going back and forth, and Woodhull, I'm guessing in part because he's so nervous, he's probably looks suspicious. He has a bad time every time he goes to the city. He's stopped and questioned by the British sentries on either side of the East River. When he's traveling the 55 miles back and forth on Long Island, He's questioned by Tory militia units, by Tory thieves and brigands who rob him, strip search him, and he hides his letters, luckily, inside his saddle with some stitching removed, and the enemy never finds anything on him, luckily. But it quickly becomes apparent that he can't keep doing this because he's raising more and more suspicion. So he pleads with Washington and Tallmadge and said, we have to find somebody in the city, or somebody who's willing to go in the city and stay there to get messages out to us. They agree, and they all start looking around, and it's Woodhull who finds the right answer. And that's Robert Townsend of Oyster Bay, who's frequently in the city doing business for his father's Oyster Bay mercantile operation. The only image of Robert Townsend is the sketch I showed you earlier, done in 1830 by his nephew. This is a portrait by Mort Kunstler, the renowned Oyster Bay artist. That's a friend of mine, which is why it's on the cover of my book. This is his version of Townsend looking at a secret letter. Now, he cited this in Raynham Hall, which isn't historically accurate because Townsend did all his spying in the city. But how Woodhull finds Townsend is when Woodhull goes into the city, it's a 55 miles trip, so he stays overnight. And he stays at his brother-in-law Amos Underhill's boarding house, which happens to be where Townsend stays when he's in the city. So they get to know each other, get to trust each other. And finally, Woodhull broaches the subject of spying to Townsend. He agrees with one condition. He said, other than Tallmadge, Woodhull, and the couriers going back and forth, including Brewster, nobody, including Washington, should ever know his identity. And Washington early on wanted to meet Woodhull, and then Tallmadge and Woodhull convinced him it's too dangerous because they know there are British double agents and spies in and around Washington's headquarters. So Washington says he will never know who they are or meet any of them after that initial discussion. So Townsend takes up the spying in the city. He decides to be Culper Jr., and then Woodhull becomes Culper Sr. So that's the first level of protection by adopting these rudimentary code names. And it becomes known only after the war as the Culper spy ring, probably because they adopted the Culper surname. And we don't know why they picked it. The one supposition by some historians is that Washington surveyed in Culpeper County, Virginia, when he was 19, and that he might have suggested the name because people would say it quickly and it would come out as Culper rather than Culpeper, sort of a quick contraction. So there's no proof. Nobody ever said why they picked the name, but that's the best guess I've heard. So this is a nice map from the Three Village Historical Society in Setauket about the route of the spy ring. So what you have is Townsend here in Manhattan writes a letter or a message in a book or other methods of conveyance, initially in visible ink and eventually in secret invisible ink. The courier, sometimes Townsend goes across the river to give it to a courier. Most of the time, the courier coming from Setauket will ride into Manhattan across the ferry and get the message, then ride on one of three roads 55 miles out to Setauket, give the message to Woodhull, who gets it to Caleb Brewster, who carries it across the Sound, where initially, Tallmadge would be waiting in person until Washington says, you're too valuable to be going back and forth and wasting time. So Tallmadge assigns a relay of dragoons, 3 every 15 miles, to carry the messages to headquarters, which works pretty well, except the British figured out the system and often do raids across the Sound from Long Island and capture some of the couriers and occasionally even capture some of the messages. Initially, this takes about 3 weeks, and Washington complains throughout the war that it's taking too long to get him information, that by the time he gets it, he's either heard it from somebody else or the British operations have changed, so it's not even useful anymore. But it's still the best information he's getting, so he encourages them. And the information they send is very, very detailed. It's this regiment with this amount of men is doing this. This ship has arrived in Manhattan with X amount of men, these supplies. It's really kind of stunning how detailed the information is. But initially it takes about 3 weeks. They get it down to about 7 to 10 days one way. If Washington and Tallmadge want to give instructions or questions to Woodhull and Townsend, they have to send it back the same route. And again, another week or 10 days. So Washington, right up to the end of the war, complains about the length of time and continually says, try to find a faster way to do it. And they try to do it through Staten Island. They try to do it from Manhattan north into the Bronx. They try to do it through Port Washington, but they can never get the right people in the right place that they can trust. And they end up stuck with Setauket for the duration. So the most loyal, most productive and fearless courier is Austin Rowe, another childhood friend from Setauket who owns a tavern out there. And this is another mural at the Setauket school showing Austin Rowe. We don't know what he looked like, but you can see he's crossed the river by ferry and he's galloping out back to get to Woodhull in Setauket. So this is one of the early letters. We know, despite Woodhull's plea to get rid of them all, 193 are known to survive at this point, either originals or copies, and they total 383 pages. And this is an early one from Woodhull directly to Washington, and you can see it's signed SC for Samuel Culper. So they're starting to take some precautions, but the message is in plain English initially. So the 193rd letter, which was just discovered last summer in the archives at the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook, they were doing some bookkeeping and record checking when they were closed for COVID, and they found an account book that recorded things that were donated to the museum, and it says a Culper spy record, a Culper spy letter, and nobody at the museum knew anything about it. So they started looking around, and they found a letter from Tallmadge to Townsend in a file that had never been cataloged, never been displayed. And it happens to be the only known letter from Tallmadge to Townsend. This is the front page. Here's the back page. You see it's signed John Bolton, which is Tallmadge's code name. And you can read about, you can see it online, you can read about it online, and this will be displayed at the Long Island Museum in person on Culper Spy Day, September 18th. So all the participants know security is an issue. The British are actively looking. They know this espionage. They know there's espionage going on. They know Setauket is involved. They know Caleb Brewster is involved. They suspect and ultimately know that Woodhull is involved. They have to catch them or catch the messages, and luckily the British are never good at doing that. But they increasingly upgrade their spycraft because they know they're in danger. So started out, this is another nice graphic from the Treeville Historical Society. Initially, they have the spy names, John Bolton, Samuel Culper, then Culper Sr. Most of them early on don't have any aliases. They realize that that's not good enough, so they start coming up with codes, and they're sort of learning this on the fly. Woodhull comes up with the first example, the first code system, and it's pretty rudimentary. It's basically replacing names with 2 digits. So you have 10 stands in for New York. Austin Rowe becomes 44. Setauket is 20. So they start to drop these numbers into the letters rather than naming names. And they do that for about 30 letters going either way. And then Tallmadge looks at this and he goes, this is still too simplistic. The British have expert code breakers, but for some reason, the British do a pretty bad job of prosecuting the war. One of the big mistakes they make is they never send any of their code experts over to America, where they could, probably have broken the code and rolled the whole ring up fairly easily once they captured even one letter. The only real person with any kind of spy background at all is the chief spy, is Major John Andre, who plays a role in the Benedict Arnold story. But even Andre is not, a code breaker. He's just an organizer. But the Culpers know they need to up their ante if they're going to stay alive. So Tallmadge takes a big step. He says we need a much more sophisticated code. So he, in July of 1779, he prepares what he calls the dictionary. And this is only one known copy survives, which is believed to be Washington's, and it's in the Library of Congress, where you can see this illustration from. So what he does is take 710 words most likely to be used in a letter, such as Congress, gun, or Navy, writes them alphabetically, and then gives them all a 3-digit code replacement. He also has a substitution code where letters replace numbers and vice versa for things that aren't in that list of 710 words. So you can see some of the code examples here. So here's Washington is 711, Clinton, the British commander, is 712, etc. So you start to see all these numbers showing up in the letters. And they use this for the duration of the war, and luckily the code was never broken. But between the early Woodhull code names and this full-blown dictionary, they come up with the best security system of all, which is a invisible ink. And they call it the stain, and the stain can only be read if you apply a second chemical that they call the counterpart to the writing. And the way they come up with this is James Jay, who's the future first Supreme Court Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, writes a letter to Washington saying, my brother James, who's a physician and amateur chemist, has come up with this chemical that you can write in, and it's invisible when you put it on, and can only be read if you put this second chemical on it. And this is a big improvement from the earlier kind of secret inks, which are often lemon juice or milk, which would dry invisibly, but then if you heated the paper, it would be visible. And since the British knew the same game, it was not at all secure to do that, so that the Culpers never bothered with either one of them. So Washington is thrilled at the prospect. He tells John Jay to get as much of the stain from his brother as quickly as possible. The chemicals apparently are hard to get, and it's hard to mix without a full-blown chemical lab, which James Jay had in London, where he worked before the war, but doesn't have one in America. Washington actually has his engineers build a lab for Jay to help make more of the stain, but it takes months for him to make enough for Washington to play with. Washington is thrilled, says, get me all you can as soon as you can, but it takes Jay months more to have enough to get an aid to Townsend, Tallmadge, and Woodhull. But when they have it, it's great. And what they start to do is write in the secret stain between the lines of a letter about something else that was innocuous, or they'd write it in the margins of a book or some other way, and they would telegraph to the recipient where to look. So it was basically foolproof if you didn't have the second chemical. So this is the basic operation. This I'm skipping over a lot and simplifying a lot, but this is how the Culper ring comes into being and how it operates. So what I want to do is spend some time talking about, as I mentioned early on, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of legend masquerading as fact. There are multiple books, at least a dozen, that deal with the spy ring, either entirely or in part, along with other spy operations. And they're just full of legends given as fact and supposition stated as fact, which is why I ended up writing a book rather than just giving my version. I basically went through all the other versions and sort of picked them apart. So I want to just talk about some of the more prominent examples of misinformation. People that know anything about the spy ring from childhood stories turn Brian Kilmeade's bestseller, The Secret Six. The most commonly known anecdote involves Anna Strong's clothesline. Anna Strong is the wife of the Patriot leader, the head of the local government in Setauket, Selah Strong. She's a neighbor and close friend of Abraham Woodhull, living around the bay, around the coast of the shoreline of the bay from him, and they're the closest neighbors to each other. So the legend is that Anna Strong would put a black petticoat on her clothesline to alert Abraham Woodhull across the bay that Caleb Brewster had showed up with, either to pick up or deliver messages. Then she would put up to 1 to 5 petticoats, 1 to 5 handkerchiefs next to the petticoat, indicating which of 5 bays around Setauket that Caleb Brewster would be waiting in. So this is a story. It's picked up, repeated as fact by Morton Pennypacker, it's in turn. It's in a lot of the books by authors who haven't done their homework, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. For one thing, we know that some of the rendezvous are arranged in letters saying, okay, we'll meet again, on this date and place. We also surmise that if they met, Brewster and Woodhull would say, okay, well, let's rendezvous a week from today or something like that. So it's not even clear they needed to communicate with a clothesline. And there's also the fact that they live within sight of each other. So Anna Strong, if she needed to get Woodhull's attention, could have rowed across the bay or ridden her horse, half a mile around the shore. So it's a nice story, but there's no proof it ever happened. It's not mentioned anywhere in the letters, diaries, or anything else. So it's total supposition. One of Anna Strong's descendants, Kate Strong, wrote a book in 1969 making the case that this was real, saying it's based on information from Pennypacker, who didn't footnote his book, and from documents and letters she saw in the family, but nobody's ever seen this proof to make it to know that it's real. So I treat this as an interesting legend without corroboration. A lot of the speculation involves this gentleman, and this is James Rivington, who was the publisher of a series of Tory pro-British newspapers before and during the Revolution. He's printing these papers before the British occupy Long Island and Manhattan, and after the Battle of Long Island. And he so angers the patriots in the city before the war breaks out that they ransack his office and destroy his printing plant. And Rivington flees to London, to save his life. When the British take over in Manhattan, he comes back, starts another newspaper called the Royal Gazette. It becomes required reading for patriot and loyalist alike, because it's really the best source of information, even if you don't like to read stories about George Washington having secret lovers and illegitimate children and things that he prints regularly. We know he had the paper. We know he had a coffee shop next to the paper, and next to those two, he's got like a mercantile store where he sells stationery and things like that, all on one side of Hanover Square near Wall Street today. We know Robert Townsend is doing business for his father in a shop across Hanover Square, so they're in proximity. We know Robert Townsend from he keeps very detailed account books of everything he buys. And he writes that where he buys paper, reams of writing paper from Rivington's store, or he buys the Gazette every week. And that's the only known connection between any of the Culpers and Rivington, which doesn't stop authors, particularly Brian Kilmeade in his bestseller, from just going wild with what Rivington is supposed to have done. Some people have Townsend being either a paid or volunteer reporter for the Gazette to give him an excuse to interview British officers who want to get into the Gazette and get information from them. Some people have Townsend being the co-owner of either the newspaper or the coffee house. No proof of any of all this. And then some people have Rivington either supplying information to the Culpers or Washington independent of the Culpers, or being an active member of the spy ring. No proof for any of this. The only proof I've seen is Brian Kilmeade cites a letter from a North Carolina elected official after the war saying something about it was great that we had Rivington's help. So there's some indication he might have either flipped sides or had secret help for the Patriot cause, but there's no proof he was ever involved with the Culper spy ring or an actual spy. A lot of the other rumors and hearsay involves Major John Andre, who I mentioned before. He's the Tallmadge's counterpart. He's the British spy chief in America. And when Benedict Arnold decides to switch sides, all the correspondence and planning goes through Andre. So some authors, now we know he stayed at Raynham Hall in Oyster Bay. Some authors, many authors have repeated a story that when Andre is at Raynham Hall, he's talking to other officers headquartered there, because the British used it as a headquarters and lodging for most of the war, that Sally Townsend, Robert's younger sister, overhears Andre talking to the other British officers about Benedict Arnold's plans to switch sides. Sally supposedly writes a letter to her brother that's carried to the city by a neighbor. Robert alerts Tallmadge. Tallmadge puts the word out, and that's how they capture Andre and almost capture Arnold, and Andre is hanged. It's a nice story. It's totally BS. No proof Sally ever heard anything. There's no proof Sally ever wrote a letter to her brother. And the best proof that this is nonsense is we know exactly when Andre stayed at Raynham Hall, and it was more than a year before the whole Arnold plot starts to unfold. And that any historian had done any homework whatsoever could have figured it out, but a lot of them say, repeat this verbatim as fact. Just lots of misinformation. Andre shows up in one of the after the clothesline story. The other widely disseminated speculation is that there was a female Culper agent, and Brian Kilmeade goes as far to call her Agent 355, which is interesting because the spies in the Revolution did not use the word agent. That's a much later term. Now, 355 is the code for lady, and in all 193 letters, there's only one reference to a 355 or a lady. That's in a letter that Woodhull writes to Washington in August of 1779. And he writes one sentence about a woman. He said, "I intend to visit 727, which is New York, before long, and think by the assistance of a 355, code for lady, of my acquaintance shall be able to outwit them all." Now, he never comes back and explains it. We have no idea who the woman is, what she did. Beverly Tyler, the historian at Setauket, surmises that the woman referred to is Anna Strong, which to me makes the most sense because they're neighbors and friends. And we know she would occasionally go to the city with him when he was gathering information to give him a cover story or arouse less suspicion. But that's all we know. That's only that one reference. So from that one reference, Pennypacker, Kilmeade, and a lot of authors just go basically, off the cliff as far as I'm concerned. Pennypacker suggested that there was not only a female Culper spy with the code name 355, but she was the mistress of Townsend. And all this is kind of weird because the only connection we know is of this woman to Woodhull and Setauket. So how Pennypacker ends up connecting her to Townsend is in the city makes no sense to me. It also Kilmeade also goes along with this story, names her Agent 355, and he surmises without any proof cited at all that this woman was a socialite Tory sympathizer from a loyalist family in the city. Andre was a big entertainer. He liked to have big parties and galas. So Brian Kilmeade says, well, this woman was probably a Tory with Patriot sympathizers, and she would go and hang around these parties and gather information and then get it to Tallmadge and off to Washington. So he has her as a full-blown member of the Culper spy ring. In fact, he says in his subtitle of his book and in the book that there were only 6 members of the Culper spy ring, one of whom is Agent 355, with no proof. He also leaves out people like Caleb Brewster and Austin Rowe. If you don't have these couriers, you don't have a spy ring. But he doesn't explain how you could have 6 people without any couriers doing the spy operation. But just on and on. I mean, some people have Agent 355, having an illegitimate child with Townsend, have her dying on a prison hulk in New York Harbor. It goes on, and it's just wild speculation. And speaking of wild speculation, then it comes to Turn, which I love to pick on. I did a story for Newsday when it first aired, and the TV critics said it's great drama, and I said it's terrible history, and I gave all the examples of why. And a few of them are right from the beginning. They have the spy ring created right after the Battle of Long Island in 1776, when it was actually more than 2 years later before anything happened with the Culpers. They show all the British troops running around Long Island wearing in redcoats, but most of the British troops on Long Island were colonial loyalist militia, like this painting by Don Troiani of Colonel Simcoe's Queen's Rangers. And they all the loyalist units that were raised locally all wore green. Little things like that bug you. But there's a couple of really whoppers. Colonel John Simcoe in Oyster Bay gets tipped off that Abraham Woodhull is a spy. So he takes the Queen's Rangers on a ride out to Setauket to grab Abraham Woodhull and question him. When he gets there, luckily for Woodhull, he's in the city getting the information. So Simcoe decides the next best source would be Woodhull's father, who's the local minister. So they grab Woodhull Sr. and the Queen's Rangers almost beat him to death trying to find out where Abraham Woodhull is and confirm that he's a spy. In turn, when you first meet the elder Woodhull in the first episode, he's an ardent Tory sympathizer, and you first meet him having tea with Simcoe and the other British officers. So far cry from being beaten to death by supporting your patriot son because you're a patriot. And the other absurdity is Anna Strong is married to Cecilia Strong. She's about 10 years older than Woodhull, is the mother of 6 young children. But in the series, they create a non-existent romantic relationship between Woodhull and Anna Strong. And in fact, the whole series sort of starts out with that, and there's no proof any of that happened. So I credit the series for generating a lot of interest in the story, and I wouldn't have written my book probably without Turn. But when people write on Facebook how they love Turn and they're learning so much about the Culper spy ring, I sort of grit my teeth. So the obvious main question of all this is, what value was the Culper spy ring to winning the revolution? And there's a whole range of positive and negative opinion about the spy ring. And interestingly, George Washington is on both sides of the spectrum. The most ardent supporter of the value of the Culper spy ring is Brian Kilmeade. He states in the book that the Culper spy ring won the war, period. It was not Washington with help from the spy ring or the Continental Army. He says these 6 spies, even though we know there are at least a dozen people involved in the spy ring, these 6 spies won the revolution single-handedly, which every other historian thinks is nonsense. But everybody else comes in somewhere else on the spectrum. Tallmadge, of course, he's biased because he operated and ran the spy ring. He writes in a memoir for his children after the war that how beneficial it was to the commander-in-chief is evidenced by his continuing the same to the close of the war. And of course, Washington continually tries to speed it up, tries to find shorter routes. He does have other information coming out of New York and other places, but never on the scale or frequency of the Culpers. But in the beginning of the war, despite his unhappiness with the speed, he relies on the Culpers, and he knows their information is accurate and valuable. And he writes that in a lot of the letters. He writes in July 1780 that he finds the intelligence, quote, of very great importance. In another letter, he states, "I rely upon this intelligence." And on April 1781, he writes, "Of their ability, I entertain a high opinion." So right in the beginning, despite the length of time it takes to get messages around, he's high on the Culpers, but that doesn't last. There's a couple of reasons. When Benedict Arnold switches sides, one of the first thing he does is go into New York because he knows all about that there's a lot of spying going on, and he makes it his mission to capture spies, and he arrests about 30 people. Luckily, none of them are the Culpers. One of them is a tailor in the city called Hercules Mulligan, who's a friend of Townsend and Tallmadge, and is definitely a spy and supplies information usually independently to Washington through his own methods, but he's also cooperating with the Culpers, and he's arrested but talks his way out of it. But when that happens, Townsend is so freaked out by the prospect of being captured that he leaves the city, goes back to Oyster Bay for 9 months, with basically stopping the Culper spy ring dead in its tracks. Washington is so frustrated, he sort of officially disbands it for that 9 months and even later. And the other thing that happens is the last couple of years of the war, Washington moves to Virginia, leading up to the successful attack on Yorktown and the British agreeing to a peace treaty and independence. So when he's down in Virginia, Washington really doesn't care much what's happening in New York, because the main armies are now are all in Virginia. So New York and Long Island to become a backwater of less importance. But there are a lot of examples cited by me and other historians showing the value of the Culper Spiring, short of the fact they didn't win the war single-handedly. The first thing you could cite is throughout the war, Woodhull and Caleb Brewster are continually giving reports of British dispositions, strengths, plans, and movements on Long Island, and they frequently recommend to Tallmadge to recommend to Washington that they come over and do a whaleboat raid, and they can capture this fort or this group of soldiers manning Oyster Bay or Setauket. And there's at least about 5 or 6 times when Washington approves raids with varying levels of success. The most successful one is an attack on a British fort down in, here's Washington later, is an attack on what is known as Fort St. George in Mastic on Great South Bay. And what the British did is they take a colonial manor house near Great South Bay. They build 2 blockhouses and then connect all 3 structures with a wooden stockade. The Tallmadge gets reports from Brewster and Woodhull saying that this fort has been built by 90 loyalist troops from Rhode Island who are now manning the fort, and the fort is woefully undermanned. It would make a great area of attack. And then they also say the British have stockpiled 300 tons of hay in quorum for their horses in the city. So when this information gets to Washington, he goes, I definitely want to do a raid to burn the hay. If you can attack and destroy the fort without too much trouble, go ahead and do that too. So Tallmadge leads a force of soldiers across the Sound in a whaleboat. They sleep under their boats in Mount Sinai. The next day they march across Long Island and attack before dawn. And it's a complete surprise. So they basically capture the fort, kill 6 British soldiers, capture another 90, burn the fort, burn the British supply ship you see in the background. This is another Setauket mural. Burn 300 tons of hay, and they get back to Mount Sinai. And about a day and a half after they leave Connecticut, they're back without losing 1 man. So these raids, are clearly successful. They get British captives, burn British supplies, keep the British off balance. The British have to keep a lot more troops on Long Island than they would like. So this is a great value. Townsend in 1779 writes a letter to Washington that a New York sailmaker named Christopher Duchenick, who everybody thinks is an ardent patriot and is actually spying for the British, and he's unmasked and captured. And probably the best example, the most important example, involves continental currency. The British throughout the war are counterfeiting the continental money, trying to deflate it so that it make it valueless, so that the Americans can't afford to buy supplies overseas and fight the war. But every time they do it, they can't get the right paper, and anybody familiar with the real currency knows that they're looking at counterfeits. And then finally, Townsend writes a letter in November of 1779 to Washington saying the British have acquired the exact same paper the Continental Congress is using for their currency from a source in Philadelphia. Washington alerts Congress that the whole financial underpinning of the war is now at stake. Congress, being Congress, can't make a decision about almost anything, diddles around for 3 months, and then finally recalls of the currency to protect the financial basis of the war. So it clearly, every historian gives the Culpers a lot of credit for helping win the war, but only Brian Kilmeade says they did it single-handedly. Going to wrap up with a postscript about George Washington's 5-day tour of Long Island in 1790. When he becomes president, Alexander Hamilton, who's now his Treasury Secretary, suggests in 1789 that he should get out in quiet periods when Congress is not in session and go see the countryside, go to places he's not familiar with, like New England and Long Island, meet the people. Washington, as a farmer, is fascinated by what people are growing, what the soil conditions and topography are. So he does a long tour of New England in 1789, and then decides to go visit Long Island for 5 days in April of 1790. The reason I talk about this tour is there are a lot of historians who I respect think that the real reason Washington comes to Long Island is to thank members of the Culper spy ring, even though the professed purpose of the trip was to see his constituency, Long Island, and answer questions he has as a farmer. I tend to accept Washington's professed thing that he was basically going out to meet his constituents and see Long Island, primarily because he kept a very detailed personal diary, and he talks about how many miles he went each day. And the trip goes along the South Shore to Patchogue, north to Setauket, and then back to the city over 5 days. And if you read the diary, which is published, he talks about where he went, how many miles he went, where he stopped for lunch, where he ate, what he ate, where he stayed overnight, who put him up, what the people were like. Talks a lot about the soil and topography, talks about the crops, not one mention of the Culper spy ring. And I look at this and say it's a secret diary, his own personal diary, written after the war. If there was some Culper connection to this trip, there's really no reason why Washington would not have mentioned it in his own personal diary. But that has not stopped a lot of other historians from saying he really went to Long Island to thank the Culpers. And there's a couple of pieces of example of evidence that they cite. He stays one night down in the Amityville area at the home of a farmer who we know was a member or a minor player in the Culper ring. But the main evidence, this is the coach that he sketch of made at the time of his coach and the white horses he carried him on Long Island. A modern painting of where he stayed the last night in Roslyn with Hendrik Onderdonk and his mill. But the best evidence, if you're trying to make the case for the Culper connection, is Row Tavern. Now, I told you this about Austin Row. This is the tavern he owns in Setauket, which still exists. It's been moved away from Route 25A, the original site, because a writer bought it in the early 1900s and wanted more peace and quiet. So he moved it to near the private road nearby. Sometime after the move, 2 additions were added. So the original Row Tavern was just the center section. And we know Washington stayed up here in the middle room on the 2nd floor. So the historians will say, okay, well, he stayed at the tavern owned by the chief courier of the Culper spy ring. So of course he knew the Culpers, and here's the Culper connection. But there's a problem with that is Rowe did not know until the day that Washington was heading for Setauket that Washington planned to stay there. And he's down on the South Shore, and Washington has a head start. So he gallops off from Patchogue to try to get back to his tavern and make arrangements for the visit of the president. Even though he's done all these trips back and forth to the city during the war, for bad luck or bad horsemanship, he's thrown and breaks his leg. So we don't know if he actually even got to his tavern when Washington was there. The historians say, well, if you know the president's coming, you're going to get there in a wagon or walk or whatever, broken leg or not. But Rowe never wrote anything to say if he got to meet Washington. Washington's diary says, I stayed at Row Tavern. The people were very nice. The food was nice. Doesn't mention Austin Rowe by name, let alone as part of the spy ring. So I tend to believe that either Rowe never got there or Washington never made the connection. So there's been a lot of interest in the spy ring. Even before Turn came along, there's historical groups that own Revolutionary War properties along the North Shore. Were pushing the state to create a heritage trail to boost history and education and tourism. Finally, in 2017, which may coincide with the end of Turn, the state created a George Washington spy trail linking Culper sites and Revolutionary War and colonial sites from Great Neck to Port Jefferson. And they put up these signs. There's a website, there's audio tours. You can hear background with each stop. So this, is keeping information and interest going in the spy ring and spy trail. So I'm going to stop there. That's me at the end of the trail in Port Jefferson. And let's see if anybody has any questions. In the meantime, I should tell you, if you want to read the book, it's in every library in Long Island, as far as I know. And it's in every bookstore on Long Island. And It's online, available at Amazon, every other online seller, Target, Walmart, sell it on Long Island. And if you really like the subject, I sell inscribed and signed copies directly. So you can email me at billblyer@gmail.com if you'd like to get one of those. And I also have an email list that you can email me to get on that if you're interested in the other 7 lectures that I give and when I'm going to give them. And I also put all that information on the Long Island history page on Facebook. So much for the commercial. Does anybody have any questions? If you